thank you for the invitation to this conference, Building Unity, Fighting Back Against the Wright Offensive. I'm here representing the TUC Joint Consultative Committee. The TUC JCC, as is it abbreviated, what I do is represent in the East Midlands the trades councils. There are a number of trades councils in the East Midlands. There's a Derby Area Trades Council where I'm president. There's Nottingham District Trades Council. There's Leicester District. There's Lincoln. There's Corby that's recent, isn't that, Rob? Corby that's come on through. So it's those groups that are a core but sometimes forgotten element of the trade union movement. Though that structure has been pivotal in terms of supporting workers who have been out on strike for better pay conditions and so on, in the sense that the Trades Council within the locality have worked with, supported, stood in solidarity with striking workers. They've been able to coordinate appropriate activities as well as community groups in supporting workers. So I suppose another word that could be used is that you're talking about a crucial, pivotal grassroots structure within the trade union movement. And I'm really, really delighted to represent a very active, hyperactive trade council group within the East Midlands, and some of them I will refer to later on in the speech. Patrick has already more or less mapped out the terrain in terms of the interface between fighting racism and fighting class struggle. But what I want to do is to pick up an element of some of the issues that he's already mapped out. And in particular, I wanted to say a little bit more about how we set about opposing the ideas of the far right. How do we oppose those ideas, the narrative, the concepts that have become almost ordinary, normalised in normal discourse? In the UK over the last 50 years, there'd been a number of far-right groups coming and going at various times. For example, the National Front, BNP, EDL, and more recently, Britain First, British Democratic, Patriotic Alternative, and so forth. These groups have rarely been sufficiently populist to gain large-scale popularity. However, UKIP emerged as an acceptable party for voter appeal. Unfortunately, I have to share with you today that the recent incarnation of UKIP, Reform UK, has 6 councillors in the city of Derby. And our mayor is Reform. Elected councillor in the city of Derby. It is indeed a scourge. These groups have a number of issues which they focus on and ideology which they stem from. They all share nationalism and either implicitly or explicitly racist at their core. Their focus is therefore a combination of anti-immigration in all its forms and cultural imperialism, emphasising the superiority of British culture. Some parties proclaim white supremacy, superiority, and the dilution of white society. There is a background of fascism in some of these parties, but all but all, I'll say this, have unstated belief in the market economy. For them, conflict is not about class struggle, the sorts of daily plight that workers are encountering that Patrick has so eloquently shared with us. Their focus, the focus of the far right, is on race rather than class. So it's about race politics rather than the class struggle. None of these parties have gained sufficient national election success compared to the National Front in France or currently the governments of Italy and Hungary. One reason for this is that over recent decades, mainstream political parties have engaged in promoting nationalism themselves. So if you can get the authentic, why vote for the peripheral? Parties such as these already mentioned are not the cause of racism in the UK. They are the symptoms of long-standing and deep-seated racism in British society. Racism, in its simple terms, is about them and us. The theme of them and us finds its acceptable expression in the discourse of nationalism we see daily in political parties, as Patrick has already mentioned, governments and in mainstream media. The increasing normalisation of nationalism within the mainstream political parties feeds into the pre-existing racism and reinforces it. Nationalism is almost always about division and often separation. It was the Nationalist Party in South Africa that produced apartheid in the 1948. It is through the Conservative Party where the espousing of nationalistic them and us ideology has become pronounced, and we've already heard how that has been so, and it's become effective. In a sense, they have legitimised some of the rhetoric of the far right parties. So the far right is not about the peripheral, it is about what is happening in our mainstream government, our mainstream party. It has been the issue of the EU that has emboldened the Conservative Party, in particular, the Nationalist Conservative Party, and their desire to leave the EU. How ironic it is that it was the Conservative Party in 1973 who took the UK into the common market and opposed by the Labour Party to leave, and the Labour Party opposed this entry. Every Labour Party manifesto until the 1980s promised to leave the common market. However, in those days, it was about class struggle, it was about class politics, and the left was about the class project. Under the Tory government of Thatcher and Major, the common market morphed into the EU and UKIP was born and gained popularity under Farage. UKIP was clearly a nationalist party with a nationalist racist agenda. This became so popular that it resulted in the 2015 referendum. It was the Tory government equivalent of Farage that took advantage of this. The Johnson regime, as described by Kenneth Clarke, the former Tory Chancellor, He described them as a bunch of English nationalists. The clear promotion of them and us politics, i.e. the EU, the UK and the EU, were about promoting division and separation. The popularity of phrases such as controlling our borders was so successful, it is now part of mainstream discourse. Nobody challenges it apart from groups like us. The phrase is now used with respect to immigration of those who would dilute British culture and change British values. Such phrases could come from the mouths of the far-right parties, as we've mentioned. The utterances of SUTR Birmingham, e.g. invasion, send them back to Rwanda, are reminiscence of Enoch Powell's Rivers of Blood speech. All this feeds into the far-right group and in a sense reinforces their message. But why should people vote for the far right in great numbers when they've got the Conservative Party? Perhaps not the fascist element, but who knows? So, in addition to taking to the streets, protesting, the Trades Council have a vital role of providing the narrative, countering the narrative of racial hostility, the narrative that is about them and us. I would like, along with the great work that trades councils are currently doing in terms of mobilising for workers who are in dispute, I would like our trades council to take on the project of a well-known revolutionary, Paulo Freire, an educator, who talked about the oppressed, who talked about the pedagogy of the oppressed. The Trades Council have a role to take on that pedagogical campaign in terms of countering the narrative of the far right that have become part of our mainstream discourse. We have a vital role there in terms of opposing the far right. It is also about the ideas. It is also about the words. It is about how people conceptualise their world. And we have a vital role in changing that conceptualisation. Thank you.